Hey, folks, here from Connecticut and Wisconsin, Scottsdale, Arizona. Boy, I bet it's a lot warmer there than it is here. We have Tennessee. We have Los Angeles, Vienna, Austria. I feel like I might have seen you before here from Vienna, Austria. Norway, Northern Virginia. Hey, Kristen from California. And Kristen, suggests that Facebook is here. So we're ready to go. I'm thrilled to be here today with Representative Joe Morelle, who represents New York's 25th district, and especially interested in talking to him today because he sits on the Appropriations Committee and is also the top ranking Democrat on the House Administration Committee. And what that means is that, I'm all excited about committees all the time, but what this means is he's in the heartbeat of a number of different important initiatives right now. So he has been put in charge of the new House task force to look at corruption in the Trump administration. And he is also the person leading the fight in the House for election security in 2026. So we have a lot to talk about. And thank you so much for being here, Representative.
Well, thank you. I am a big fan. And I told you I'm so enjoying the Democracy Awakening book. It's been on my shelf too long, but I've been reading it. It's a great read, and I'm a huge fan, so I'm delighted to be here.
Well, super. I'm actually at work on a new one. But let's start right in on committees because, it's funny. If you think back to the Kennedy-Nixon debates way back, right, in the past, they talked a lot about their committee assignments and how they performed on their committees. And I find it fascinating that we've sort of gotten away from what committees actually do. Now, you sit on the Appropriations Committee and House Administration, but I wonder if you can describe for people, first of all, what the Appropriations Committee does and why that's different than Ways and Means, both very important committees that seem to do the same thing, but they don't. And then what the House Administration does.
Yeah, that's right. And I agree with you that committees are sort of a logical outcropping of a large body of people, and you have different responsibilities, different jurisdictions. So you just assign people to have expertise in certain pieces, then to recommend to the fuller group, the full House legislation. So I serve on two. And, it's such a great question. Appropriations, Ways and Means, they sound similar. Don't they do similar things? And in fact, when I was in the New York State Assembly, I served on the Assembly Ways and Means Committee, and we did both things that the two committees do. So that was combined in one committee. Here in the House, Appropriations has responsibility for setting the targets on what money we'll spend. We do 12 appropriation bills, all by subject matter, and we recommend discretionary spending on all those items. Ways and Means in the House has responsibility for tax policy effectively. So generating the revenue that will exist to be able to pay for the things that the appropriators think we ought to spend money on. To further complicate it, in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, you have authorizing committees and appropriating committees. So the authorizers come up with the programs. They may say you can spend up to $1 billion on this activity. The appropriators then take that authorization and say, we're not going to spend $1 billion, but we do think we'll spend $370 million on this activity. So it's a really distributed system. It also would lead one to think about, shouldn't this all come together in some way, which was my experience in New York. It all would have to balance, and you'd have to have appropriations, what you're going to spend, match up with the revenues that you take in, because states have to have balanced budgets. Of course, the federal government does not. And we typically are running a deficit, which is why the federal deficit and the federal debt is becoming more of an issue, but partly because those things don't have to exactly add up.
So just to be clear there, I want to reiterate that because it's really important. States have to have balanced budgets. The federal government does not.
Correct. And, we don't talk about it as much as I think we ought to. We have accumulated federal debt of $37 trillion. The big, so-called beautiful bill, we have different names for it than that, you can imagine, added $5 trillion to an already large federal debt, and it should be of great concern to us. And someday maybe you'll invite me back and I'll give you some of my thoughts on that. But the notion is that we don't have to balance it. And we don't, and we haven't. I don't think the last time we had a surplus was during the Clinton administration. So that goes back a long way.
Right. The last Republican, by the way, to balance the budget was Dwight Eisenhower, although
Yes.
Clinton did it with the help of George H.W. Bush's earlier legislation. And I would love to do that because tax policy thrills me. It says what a country cares about. But that's not actually what I wanted to talk
I
about
agree
today.
with you. So I'd love to come back and talk about that because I agree with you.
We're like tax nerds. I had this incredible woman on the other day who also is all over taxes, and it's just the stuff just sings. All right, but now what does the House Administration Committee do?
So it's the oldest committee in the House. Originally, it was created right after in the first Congress. It was called the Committee on Elections, and it was intended to look at elections to the House of Representatives. And the Constitution has this, what people might think is an unusual provision, that the people who are the final arbiters of who sits in the House are fellow House members. So when there's a contested election, the members of the House determine who the winner of a particular election might be. So out of that came additional responsibilities for administering the House. So all the things that you would think of administration when it's building repairs, whether it's all manner of things running the House here, fall to my committee. But because of its original jurisdiction, federal elections are also under our jurisdiction. So if there's a question of what kind of rules the federal government might impose on the states as it relates to the federal elections, only president, U.S. Senate, and the House, not local elections, not state legislative, not local tax assessor, that's up to the states. But for federal elections, we have a role to play. And as you know, the Constitution sets forth time, place, and manner of elections by state legislatures. So we have 50 different systems. But the other provision is that Congress has the right to also make decisions that affect federal elections. So that's where those changes come through my committee.
Okay, let's start with the new task force that the Democrats announced this week, although I believe it had been in the works for months, looking into corruption in the Trump administration. Tell us about that, what you're hoping to accomplish, and how you're going to go about it.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Hakeem Jeffries, who I served with in the state legislature, I've known for a number of years, when he first asked me if I would take on this role to lead this committee, we began talking about the kind of reforms we would like to see to help rebuild trust in the American people in their government. I think it's nearly an all-time low. People are disaffected. When 80 million voting age people don't participate in a presidential election, it's a pretty big warning sign that people have either given up, don't have faith in the government, or have too many obstacles to be able to vote. So I want to get that number down dramatically. But one of the ways you do it is to rebuild trust, make people feel that their vote counts. And when we start to get away from that, and when people start to lose trust in a democracy, as you've written about extensively, that's more than a big problem. That's a fundamental existential threat to the democracy. So we began talking about it. Hakeem gave me the charge of, I want you to essentially help organize the anti-corruption effort that we're going to make if we win the majority. And we'll begin that effort next January. So I've been working with staff, but I've been meeting with members and delegations of members, going through what they would like to see. It was my idea to create the task force so I would have both a geographic and an ideological diversity of members have input into the work that we're doing. So that's now going to take effect, and we're going to start having some internal discussions around what people want to see. I think the way I view this is really 4 buckets. 3 of them will mirror the 3 branches. So I want to look at legislative policy. What kinds of things can we do to give people more faith in the Congress so that they don't feel like everyone is self-dealing? Things like the stock trading ban, which I think not only should be for members of Congress, I think it needs to extend to the president, vice president, cabinet members, and the Supreme Court. But what other ways can we be thinking about that would improve the operations of the House and Senate, but also add to the credibility that it has with the American public? Second bucket, the executive branch. I don't think there's been, certainly not in the modern era, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find a president who has monetized the office of the presidency more than Donald Trump, in violation of what I believe is the Emoluments Clause. But we want to think about other ways that we make certain in the future, that we don't just rely on norms and precedents, which has really been the practice, but we actually instill more rules and change statute to make that happen. And then finally, the third of the four buckets is the Supreme Court and the judiciary. No code of ethics. I think we're seriously looking at whether or not we can create a sort of senior status for members of the court who have served a period of time. 18 years is one of the numbers that we're thinking of. So every 2 years, a Supreme Court justice would go to senior status potentially and have every president, both parties, name two during a 4-year term. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about in the third bucket. And then the fourth is all the things we need to do to make the election process fairer, to reduce the influence of dark money, to take it out of the hands of billionaires. I was on Inauguration Day last year. I was in the rotunda, and sitting behind the president, as we, is now famously or infamously noted, 6 billionaires. They have extraordinary influence. You think back to the Gilded Age. There may not be a time in American history where, and I don't like to use the term oligarchs because it sounds like, one of my courses at school, but a small group of people with extraordinary economic power are leveraging elections. And so thinking about how do we bring this back to the people? I think these reforms, if we do them right, will be as dramatic as anything we've seen since Watergate. And we're committed to it. Hakeem Jeffries is committed to it. I'm committed to it. I know the members are. So we're going to work through that. And hopefully by January, begin, if I'm blessed enough to be the chairman of the committee, start hearings almost immediately. The first week of January, I'll start calling hearings on it. But we're going to look at all of this. And the three tests ultimately, Heather, are what we're doing. Is it going to make a difference? Are these things going to effectively make our government better? Secondly, will the public gain confidence? Will they see these as being legitimately important to advancing the work of the American people? And finally, what can I get 218 or more votes for? So, it'll be a process, but we have been spending a lot of time working on it. It goes back to last year, actually. About a year I've been working on this. And now over the next several months, people will begin to hear more about it. The task force is essential because it's going to help inform me and guide me as we get ready to hopefully win the majority and take over leadership of the House.
So help me out to figure out exactly how you do this. What does this literally look like on a day-to-day basis? That is, are there people looking into, you might want to explain to people what the Emoluments Clause is. Are there people looking into violations? Are there people simply coming to you and saying, well, this is what worked in another country? I mean, is this theoretical? Is this investigative? Is this legislative? When you get up in the morning and say, I'm going to work today on this task force, what do you and your staff actually do?
I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to review and look at the last decade, the last couple of decades. Where have we moved from to, and how has that threatened our democracy? And what could we do as a Congress to change the way that the government literally functions, to be able to get it to a place where, again, it's really delivering on the promise of a democracy. How do we make this more effective? How do we meet the needs of the American people? But how do we gain their trust? So it is looking at what other people are doing. We'll look at other democracies. We're looking at past legislative things, because I'm not inventing it out of whole cloth. There's thousands of great ideas that have been circulating. How do we pull it together in a package? And certainly consulting with a lot of outside groups. I mean, there are think tanks and there are civil society groups, many of whom have been opining on this and thinking about it. So really drawing from their experiences and their ideas. And then ultimately the test of legislation is, can you pass it, right? So what kind of trade-offs will there be? Where do members have concerns? So I've been going around, as I said, meeting with all my colleagues and taking notes on the things that they care deeply about, things that they would consider sort of bright lines that we have to include, other things that they have concerns about. I'll tell you one, for instance, the whole notion of independent redistricting, which I think House Democrats believe strongly in, but having watched what's happened in Texas, what may be happening in Florida, the response that was necessary, in our view, in California and Virginia. So I think what we want to do is we want to have national standards on independent redistricting across the country. But we don't want to tie up certain states. In my home state of New York, we have a constitution that does not allow mid-decade redistricting unless ordered by a court. So we've sort of, got, in some ways we feel as Democrats that it's an unequal way of doing this. In Texas, they've redistricted, I don't know how many times. North Carolina, it feels like an annual rite of passage for them to redistrict. And one thing I really appreciate about President Trump is that he says the quiet part out loud. He is not afraid to say, I'm doing all these electoral changes, not because they're better for the country, not because they improve the government, but because they're better for my political base. I want Republicans to dominate. Therefore, I'm going to change the election laws to do that. And I'm watching, obviously, we're all watching what's happened in Hungary. And the complaints about Orban was the same thing, that he used his party to basically dictate how the government would function, which is clearly not supposed to happen and can happen in a functioning democracy.
Well, so one of the things that you're identifying is something that has jumped out to me is that, in fact, we had a lot of these measures in place on the books after Watergate, when we had a similar reckoning with the fact that the people in power were using the power of the government for their party rather than for the good of the American people. But to me, it's a really interesting question of how we got to a place where those laws now under the Trump administration, they're simply being ignored. The Impoundment Control Act of 1974 that was deliberately articulated that withholding money that Congress had appropriated was unconstitutional. Yeah, that's just out the window. And the thing that strikes me in this moment is that we already have on the books an awful lot of what you're talking about. But with the Department of Justice having been so corrupted, it doesn't seem to matter what the laws are. And I don't know, I guess speaking as not your constituent, but a constituent, just enforcing the laws that are already on the books would go against everybody, would go a long way to giving me some faith.
It is one of the most frustrating things that you have to do is appear in front of your constituents. They stop this. And, at the end, and this is not a good answer, this is not going to make anybody feel particularly comfortable. We all live to some degree under this social compact. I mean, the social compact is we are going to abide by the laws, that we have three branches of government, each with their own roles, each intended to be a block on the dominance of any one. People, and I'm talking to a professor, so I shouldn't do this. I should be careful. But, when we created this Constitution, we had two recent experiences, not just the one. We had the revolution where we, basically declared our independence from a monarchy. So we had that experience clearly in mind, but we also had the experience of the Articles of Confederacy, which was a loose government, a loose central government that really ultimately led to inefficiencies and no way of enforcing tax policy. So those two different things came together and we start to build this new government, which has now survived 239 years under this. But it does in many ways rely on one thing, which is the good faith of the participants. And the sad thing about this president, and I think he's to some degree anomalous in the history of presidents, doesn't seem to have any interest in the people he serves. In fact, I often, it's half joking, but it's really less joke. I think the three questions that never get asked in the Oval Office: is this constitutional? Is this legal? Is this ethical? So to some degree, with the presidency and the way we've constructed this, he has agencies prepared to do whatever he instructs them to do without regard to what the law is or constitution, in some cases, even what judicial renderings may be. So we are at in my mind, a very fragile place in America. And the only way we get to a point where the public is willing to accept this is to give them some faith that the institutions, which before they relied on, which they have less and less faith in, that we can do the right thing. And I think then help hopefully build a little bit of trust in our government, because a democracy, as I said earlier, and you've written about, a democracy that doesn't have the faith of the people becomes an existential threat. And I so much appreciate it, because I always say to people about this, Adolf Hitler didn't come to power by virtue of a gun or an army. He was elected German chancellor. He wrote, then corrupted the laws. I mean, we know the history, but it's a functioning democracy, which is the only real hedge against a dictatorship and authoritarian government.
Well, it does interest me that Magyar in Hungary is treating Orban's people not as a legitimate opposition, but as an existential threat to the country, which I think is something we need to look at very seriously. But one of the things that jumps out about what you're saying to me is the degree to which the changes you are suggesting to reinforce faith in democracy do come down to elections. And one of the changes we have had since Watergate and the Watergate reforms was Citizens United and the amount of money that's now flowing into our elections. So, on the House Administration Committee and the work you're doing there on election security, what are you doing, and how should we be thinking about that? Because I know people are extremely concerned about the security of the 2026 election.
Yeah, so much of the electoral reform you'll see in the anti-corruption package that relates to constitutional amendment to end Citizens United, but to look at the Disclose Act, which would require the disclosure of dark money. So, public financing. There are a number of things that you'll see in the anti-corruption package. But you're right to point out, and people are understandably anxious about the midterms. I mean, the president has said at various times, I don't even know why we need midterm elections. Or say that he said he regrets not calling out the National Guard. Now, it's sort of interesting. Just moments ago, I was at a appropriations subcommittee. I serve on defense. We had the National Guard there. I asked General Nordhaus, who heads the National Guard, this is troubling. The president said he regrets not calling you out in 2020. And there are many people in America concerned. Are the National Guard going to show up? Are ICE agents going to show up? Tell me, help me, ease the anxieties of Americans, General, about what you think the role will be. And he said, look, we're going to follow the Constitution. We're going to follow the law. And I said to him, look, I'm going to stay connected to you to ensure that that happens. It is against federal law for federal agents or armed people to be at polling places. It's both a form of voter intimidation and it's a violation of law. It's a criminal penalty that's associated with it. And to anybody in the chain of command, not just the president if he issues the order, but any single member of the military and the National Guard who violates federal law is subject to criminal penalties. So we're going to do a number of things. We're going to continue to try to legislate. We're going to litigate. We're going to communicate. We're going to educate, and we're going to agitate. So I was just in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Las Vegas. I was in Dallas. I'm going to travel around the country talking to election officials, reminding them not of their responsibilities, which they already take very seriously. Republican or Democrat, local election officials just want to do the right thing, but reminding them what the federal laws are, how they're protected. We're going to develop a toolkit, which we're going to release to members in the next several weeks. That's going to give them not only things for them to do in their home communities, but things that volunteers can do, things that voters should do, things that community groups should do, things that Board of Elections and Inspectors should know and be reminded of. So I think the best thing we can do is, first of all, tell voters, check your registration status wherever you are. And second, make sure you understand how to vote and to vote early if you can, because all the intimidation tactics in the world don't matter if you've already voted. So this is going to be a process, but we are laser focused. And that's not just from today till Election Day. It's from today until January 3rd, when the House organizes in 2027.
So can you just tell us a little bit why you just picked that date? I actually have one other question for you, but it just jumps out that you picked that January 3rd date.
Because that's the date that the House of Representatives will convene in the 120th Congress. So, and it's one of these interesting things, and I'll really digress for just 10 seconds. In the state legislature where I come from, we would take the oath of office to members first and then go to the election of a speaker. It's not the way it happens in the House of Representatives. You elect a speaker first from a roll call of people who are added to the roll call by certificates sent by the various states certifying the election of the 435 members who will vote. So, there are things that have to happen on January 3rd. And if there are contested elections because they're too close or there's some question about the legitimacy of an election, that will be something we will have to consider in the House. So my sort of, tabletop exercises literally go from every day before Election Day to Election Day, the counting afterward, the certification, and then the organizing of the House on January 3rd.
Interesting. And just not to horrify you, but there are occasions on which the House can't organize because of those things.
Well,
Look at
we're looking at all of the historical precedents, and frankly, I even and the team that's working on this try to come up with scenarios that have never happened before. And the sentence usually starts like, "I know this is crazy, and it's going to sound crazy, but with this president, honestly, and this is, I say this, I know it sounds kind of funny, but with this president, there is nothing off the table in my mind. So we have to prepare for every contingency." And our goal is, first of all, to mitigate anything we think that could happen, and then, of course, respond to it. But my hope is we'll be able to mitigate. And part of the way we do it is by having conversations like this, so people know what we're doing and know, here's the advice. Make sure you know what you're doing. Make sure your friends and family know how to vote. Make sure you know where your polling places are. Reach out to us if there are any questions. We'll direct you to the proper people. And look, I'm glad this is April. It seems like a long way away, but we're going to need a long on-ramp to make sure that this election comes off as it has to.
Well, and that's the last piece that I wanted you to give to us today. That is, you just spoke of the things that volunteers could do. Certainly, people should be checking their own registrations and making a plan to vote. But I know a lot of the people I talk to are deeply concerned about the security of our elections and are, very eager to do whatever it will take at a local, state, or national level to protect those elections. So, what would you say to people that they should be doing going forward, either on the idea of corruption and reinforcing the faith in American democracy, or with the idea of protecting the 2026 and later elections?
Well, certainly on the first and the corruption effort and the democracy reform exercise, get in touch with your elected representatives. I have 213 colleagues around the country that are very, very engaged in this effort. So be communicating with them, communicate with us. If you're part of a group like Common Cause or Defend the Vote or all the other amazing groups and Citizens United, communicate with them. That we're talking to them on an ongoing basis. So that's one way. Share with us your ideas. As it relates to what they can do on the ground, work with community groups, talk to your election officials, maybe even be willing to volunteer to be an election inspector. Certainly check your registration status, make sure you vote, make sure your friends and family are voting. Check social media to make sure we're talking to the social media platforms about their responsibility in this moment. And I've been heartened to see their interest. We're going to continue to talk, and they've agreed to come back to the table to talk about the things that we can do. There's so much here that can go wrong, but I do want to leave people with this, though. I don't want people to be terrified. American elections are secure. People should have confidence in them. What keeps me up, or what I think about, are the ways that this president might try to upset that balance, which has existed for so long. And so we're going to keep working at it. And it's like a lot of things that you think it might be a low likelihood that something happens, but you still take precautions. And that's what I'm trying to encourage people. Let's take every precaution, because this is far too important. And, when you're somebody like me who's always out talking to people about voting, we often say this is the most important election in our lifetime, when it's a city council race or a mayor's race. Trust me, this is the most important midterm election in the life of this republic, at least since the Civil War, but I would argue one of the most important in American history.
Well, why don't you come back and we'll talk about that again, Representative, because I'm going to give you a run for your money with 1890. Thank you so much for being here. This has been really helpful. And please do come back and talk not only about taxes, but about midterm elections. That would be lovely. Thank you for being here.
I'm grateful to you for all your incredible work. Thanks so much.
Well, and thank you everybody for being here today. And we'll talk to you again soon.